Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started on this topic of the persistence of Keynesian macroeconomics. I used to think that this topic was sort of superfluous in years past. Haven't we driven the final nail in the coffin of Keynesianism, especially the kind of vulgar Keynesianism, the naive Keynesianism? Isn't this long gone now, dead and buried? Well, no, it's not, right? I mean, what's the reaction of the intellectual elite, of the Nobel Prize winners, to this recent downturn? It's nothing but vulgar Keynesianism, right? It's Krugman. And we're not doing enough. The $787 billion isn't enough. In Japan, the Japanese were in malaise for a decade because they didn't do enough. Oh, well, okay, So I guess this is still a live topic. And in terms of the persistence of this, I on that particular theme, I don't want to talk about the obvious thing. Obviously, what creates a persistence for a Keynesian view of the macroeconomy is the political implications of it. So we know that Keynesianism was alive and well before Keynes wrote the general theory. So we get Keynesianism in Hoover and Roosevelt and all the other Mussolini or whatever, all the other leaders of the 1930s. So I don't want to talk about that. That's obvious, and you see this right away. What I want to talk about in terms of persistence is what we might call the ideology behind Keynesianism, the philosophy behind it, if you will. And again, I don't want to talk about this in great detail. I just want to be suggestive of what Keynes himself held as the background for his development of the general theory, his views in the general theory. And it's pretty clear that what Keynes did was attempt to take his philosophical views and provide a pseudo-scientific rationalization for them in the book. I don't think this is particularly controversial even anymore to say this. In a way, then, this is just like Marxism. So the parallels are pretty complete. So we get this sort of philosophical framework, and then a pseudo-scientific facade that's designed to provide a justification, if you will, for it. So Marx, remember, famously said that he would develop a scientific socialism, right? Scientific view of the socialist paradigm, as opposed to the non-scientific views that came before, Proudhon and all that, Kool-Aid in the oceans and all that stuff. Okay, so in one sense, if this is true, then what we should see in debates and so on about Keynesianism or about Marxism is a lot of sort of backtracking and denial of certain things, restating of the theory in order to cover certain cases and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is exactly what we see, right? Anytime someone is trying to have a philosophical view pushed through a particular scientific framework, any anomalies that occur in the world will have to be just simply adjusted for. So you remember the famous one for Marx was the immiseration of the working class. So Marx famously said, look, there's going to be increasing immiseration of the working class. The profit rate is driven to zero. There's greater exploitation that the capitalist does of the workers, and so on. And then when the normal economic progress occurs of the capitalist order and the workers seem to be getting better and better off, then it became, this falsifies their view, right? So then they say, oh, it's relative immiseration. Right? It's that the working class only has one yacht instead of two, like the bourgeoisie. So it's the same sort of thing with Keynesianism, right? When we have a big stimulus program and it doesn't do anything, we have Japan, right? And there's trillions of yen of stimulus and nothing happens, then it's always, oh, they didn't do enough. So somehow the multiplier process, you all remember from your introductory classes, right, drops out. Isn't the multiplier supposed to be that just a little dollop of government expenditure will multiply into a vast array of productive activity in the economy? But, well, somehow all that drops out, right? And no, we need more. The problem was we didn't do enough. So this is the kind of thing you see, right? Okay, so let me quickly go through an overview, at least, of the philosophical background here. And then we want to see, what I want to spend most of the time on is seeing how, with this philosophical framework in mind, Keynes spun out an economic theory to provide this kind of justification, this sort of theoretical facade, if you will. And then you've heard again about how it's been adjusted and so on in other lectures, and how it stacks up against different views of the business cycle and so on and so forth. Okay, Joe Salerno wrote a great article about this, by the way, in the old RAE, so I'm just kind of summarizing his demonstration in that article. And what he argues is that Keynesianism philosophically is really a form of what in the literature is called millennialism. Or others call this a progressive utopianism. Right? So the progressive movement of Keynes was sort of part of that progressive movement of the early 20th century. And millennialism, of course, is a Christian heresy that comes from the book of Revelation, in which it talks about a millennial reign, a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, sometime in history, where a strong angel comes out of heaven and binds the devil, and so he can't do his evil machinations. And so this creates a blissful time on earth, time of peace and prosperity and brotherhood and what have you. And then the devil is loosed again, and there's a final apocalyptic battle, and just when it appears that the forces of evil will overcome the saints and the forces of good, God strikes from heaven, strikes a final blow, and the battle is won. So there's a sort of surprise victory at the end. Now, you probably already know, of course, that it was Hegel who pantheizes this millennialism, and then Feuerbach who sort of atheizes it, or Marx who atheizes it. And we get this, in Western thought, we get this Christian heretical tradition, if you will. It goes back before Hegel, but for our purposes we can just start there. And so what Hegel said was, look, there are different epochs in history and different periods, right, eras. And these different eras are just like in the scripture, they're sort of driven by God's will. God is working His will in these different epochs. There's the era of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There's always three in these millennial heresies. There are always three periods of history, three basic periods of history. And we move from one basic period to the next, right? So we move from this early stage to the next stage, and then from that stage to the final stage. And we do this through some sort of mysterious, there's some kind of mysterious force that presses us on. With Hegel, it's the Zeitgeist, it's the world spirit that creates this Aufbauung, right? It lifts up the existing order into something else, the negation of itself, or however crazy stuff he said about this. And we move then successively from one stage to the next. All right, so in millennial thinking, we always have these stages of history. We always have some sort of telos, some sort of end in mind. The will of God is bringing history to a particular end through these stages. Right, so we have the idea that there's some end to history that history is aiming at, and we have some force that's driving the historical process through these stages. And again, I don't want to talk any more detail about the basic framework because we don't need to have too much of that background in order just to see how Keynes himself put the different pieces of this kind of framework together. Okay, so first let's start with Keynes's ideas in this kind of millennial framework. Let's start first with the end that he had in mind. That's always the most important thing. What's the final utopian state of history for Keynes. And of course, everything then is driven by that conception of the end. And what Keynes said is that history is moving toward a final utopian state where all of our material desires are satisfied. We're productive enough we have enough capital accumulation, right, to produce our material needs. And with our leisure time, we spend this leisure time in contemplation of objects of love and friendship. That's the highest end for human life, according to Keynes. He gets this idea from the philosopher G.E. Moore. Now you notice the key for our purposes in seeing how this translates into economics for Keynes is that contemplation is a completely present-oriented good. There are no stages of production here, right? If we want to contemplate, we can directly attain this end through the act of just sitting and thinking. So present-oriented goods are better than future. Anything that draws us toward future ends is a distraction for Keynes. It goes against this idea that what we should be doing with our lives is simply sitting and contemplating the objects of our love and friendship and so on. So this is key, right? That's why all economic activity all important economic activity in Keynes is present-oriented. Present consumption. Present investment. Hang the future. The future is bad. Any sort of future orientation is bad. It distracts us from this final end. Okay, now what about the social process? What about this, how does history sort of move in the process of developing this end state? How do we go from where we are, where we're not present oriented and we're not contemplating the objects of love and so on, friendship and what have you, to this end? And here Keynes borrows from Alfred Marshall. So he was a Marshallian in this respect. And Marshall argued that social progress is what he called an increasing standard of life. Now this includes material well-being, our standards of living. So, it includes over time having better goods through capital accumulation. We get better health care and better nutrition and better communication devices and so on. But it also includes, more importantly, again, for both Marshall and Keynes, it includes the development of higher ends through the pursuit of appropriate leisure activity. So as we become more productive, we can satisfy our material needs in just 4 hours of production a day, maybe. Right? The workday used to be longer, 12 hours or whatever, grubbing in the field, and now it's down to 8, and the natural progress of life is it'll go down to 4 and then 1 and then half an hour we'll be able to produce all our material needs. And we'll have all this leisure time. And we can progress if we direct our leisure time appropriately to things that really matter, to the higher ends. So Alfred Marshall thought that this process would occur through a vanguard. Again, these millennial theories usually have a vanguard that leads the way. Right, and his vanguard was the Victorian gentleman, the bourgeois entrepreneur of the 19th century. Why did he think this? Well, he thought that these guys will get leisure time before the working class, and so they'll be in a position to pioneer this process. And what you have to do is convince them that what they should be doing with their leisure time is not playing golf, not watching the shopping channel, or wasting their time. They should be patronizing the arts, high culture, right? They should be going to the opera. They should be, funding great works of writing, painting, and so on. And if you could convince them to do this, then they will provide the example that the lower classes, the less wealthy, who don't have leisure yet to pursue these ends, will emulate. And then we can lead, then the market would provide a natural process by which we would move into a better standard of life, as Marshall put it. Okay, then what about the stages of history? Remember again we said that millennial thinking is always in stages of history. We we're sort of locked into one stage, and then we, through some usually mysterious process, we jump into another stage and then jump into another one. Okay, here Keynes borrowed from J.R. Commons. And Commons said there are three basic stages of human history. What he called the Era of Scarcity, which occurred from the beginning of human history up to maybe the 15th or 16th century. This was a period of very limited liberty and property rights and economic activity, and so there was virtually no economic progress, and people lived more or less the same way, kind of hand to mouth. Of course, right? We can't progress to a higher standard of life in situations like that. We don't have any leisure time. We're grubbing around and sleeping all the time. Then, for whatever reason, again, we're not interested in Commons' reasons why we move to the next stage. We're interested in what Keynes said. But just to describe the stages, in the second stage, Commons says this is the era of abundance. This begins in the 17th and the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution, right? So now we start to get capital accumulation for whatever reason, become more productive, standards of living begin to rise. But unfortunately, is the fly in the ointment, there's always some defect in these stages until we reach the last one. Human character is molded to this kind of homo economicus model. In other words, in order to drive this process of capital accumulation, human attention is drawn just toward money making and economic calculation and future orientation and these sorts of capitalist features. Well, this is no good. This cuts out all of the really higher and more valuable ends of life, like being charitable and pursuing the higher arts and so on and so forth. So we get some good things in the second stage and some bad things. Okay. And then, so what we have to do in the third stage then is to leave the capital accumulation process going. We need to keep that going. We like that part. But we need to radically transform people's judgments of value that influences their character. We need to change people's character. We need to make them more attentive to other sorts of things, justice, charity, and so on and so forth. And by the way, if it takes the state to do this, well, okay, that's perfectly okay with these guys. They don't see any difficulty either logistically in doing this through the state or sort of practically. That is, does it work? Marshall again didn't believe this. He thought the natural process of the market would take care of this. He thought we could have both just through the natural process of the market. Commons did not. Commons thought we had to have the state step in to, let's say, equalize income or to provide, greater justice to the poor or charity to the poor forcibly. And that would somehow change the character traits of human beings, and then we would be in a better, what he called the era of stabilization. Okay, so it's a similar thing for Keynes. We have these stages, right, and we're sort of stuck in this era of abundance. The problem is we've got capital accumulation going on, which we like, but we have human character that has been molded in a way that we do not like. And so we want to keep the capital accumulation going while changing the character traits and it appears that this sets up a real problem for us, right? Because isn't it precisely the character traits, so to speak, that are driving the capital accumulation process? Isn't it because we're future oriented and we're able to engage in economic calculation as entrepreneurs and that we have private property and we're concerned about profitability and losses and so on and so forth? Isn't this precisely what is driving the capital accumulation process? We know capital accumulation is driven by lowering time preferences, but lower time preferences means that we're paying more attention to the future, not less, right? That we're willing to sacrifice the present for the future. But this is precisely what Keynes doesn't want. He wants us to focus on the present and yet accumulate capital. You see his problem? So really his theory is just designed to first and foremost to address this problem, to solve this problem. How can you have present orientation on the part of people and capital accumulation? That's the main problem for Keynes, economically speaking. Okay, so first he wants to make a case against capitalism with respect to capital accumulation. He wants to say, why should we think that capitalism will provide the, sort of the optimal amount of capital accumulation? And then he wants to suggest he wants to come up with a better institutional framework for accumulating capital. And remember again, when you think about Keynes as having this goal in mind, he wants rapid capital accumulation. All of the Keynesian policies fall into place, right? They seem to, right, especially credit expansion, monetary inflation, credit expansion. We get capital built this way, right? Forget about whether it's a malinvestment or not. We'll have to Keynes will have to deal with that in his economic theory. But just for the moment, forgetting about that, we get actual physical things built. This is a good thing for Keynes. That's why he suggests it. Okay, so what's wrong with capital accumulation and capitalism? Well, first, Keynes says, capital accumulation in capitalism depends upon what he calls a double bluff. First of all, the workers who, build the capital and engage in production receive very little of the value of what they produce. So they just get the pittance, they get the crumbs, fall off the table. The capitalists get the lion's share of the value of what's being produced, but paradoxically, they can't enjoy it, right? Because in order to keep capital accumulation going, they have to plow all of their profits back into the business. And so they never get any benefit from it either in present consumption. Right? So nobody does. Nobody gets any benefit from this. And so he asked the question, why do people do it then? If they don't get any, sort of material benefit from the capital accumulation process, why do they do it? And Keynes said, well, they do it for religious purposes. They have religious convictions. They think that, morally speaking, saving is a good thing to do. A sort of, Weber's thesis. They have a Protestant ethic. And so they think saving is a moral imperative. And they think a modest consumption, again, is a religious duty. Now, why is this a problem? Why can't one just say, well, okay, so that's the way the bourgeois society is. Why can't it just go on like this? And Keynes says, well, it can't go on like this because as Keynes and all his friends knew, the Christian religion is finished, right? It's just a historical anomaly, and it's obviously false. And since it is, it's going to pass into the dustbin of history. And when it does, this whole process will crash to the ground. Right? He was thoroughly convinced of this. Okay, so that's a problem. Let's prepare in advance for this coming collapse and to get out of this mindset. Okay, so he then went on to the next step of this, right? To say, well, look, just like Alfred Marshall counsels us, we should have a vanguard. Nothing wrong. Then we need a vanguard, in other words, to show people this. Keynes, I and my friends, we need to step out, and we need to come out of the closet as present-oriented guys, and we need to start to show people how the proper way to live, contemplating love and friendship, and forgetting about economic calculation and future orientation. We need to dwell on the present. We need to draw people toward the present. We need to tell them, in other words, that they should be consuming. Consume. That's great. Why? Because now you're orienting yourself toward the present, not toward the correct objects of present consumption, which are contemplating love and friendship. But at least you're not just thinking about the future anymore. So that's better. We can draw you toward the present. And so he thought this was appropriate. Now's the time. Let's have a vanguard. He also thought, of course, that the state must step in. There's certain interventions that the state needs to take. Now's the time, right? The collapse of the Christian religion is in the offing. It's imminent, and we need to do this now. Even though some people will balk at this, but so what? They lack the vision that we have. And so we need to let the state step in. They should manipulate interest rates, right? This is fine. Manipulate credit markets. That's great. Again, this draws us toward the present. They should, maybe partially socialize investment or direct investment. That would be good too. Take it out of the hands of the entrepreneurs and scientifically manage investment. He thought that was fine. This is even before he wrote the general theory. He had these ideas. And then this process of transforming character. Again, he thought that this would start first on a material grounds. We could convince people to spend more on present goods and move their attention to the present. And then we could direct their attention away from material things and toward these spiritual goals of contemplation. Right? So that was the steps of social progress, if you will. Okay, now when the Depression hit, Keynes became more radicalized. And so he was developing these views even before the 1930s, and had this framework in mind, and it offered certain ideas about this connection between his philosophical views and economics. But he became energized and radicalized by the Great Depression. He came to believe that the Great Depression illustrated that you needed a more radical set of state control over the economy to actually reach this final utopian stage. You couldn't just leave it in this halfway house of, a little bit of state intervention and a kind of a moral suasion of the vanguard and so on. This was not sufficient. That capitalism was actually doomed, and if it wasn't, if we didn't radically transform it somehow, it would sink into a stagnation and oblivion, and we would never get out of this suboptimal equilibrium, if you will. Okay, so what does he say? We want to now just go to the general theory and look at the pillars of the general theory, the economic theories he offers to us, and how each one of them relates to this question of linking his views to philosophy. And so he starts with this idea of what he calls effective demand. This is his first, major theory in the general theory. And this is a famous equation that he starts up with. He says, well, income and employment depend only upon what he called effective demand. We call it aggregate demand today. But present consumption, right, and investment, which is also present spending. Of course, it's for future benefit, but at least it's present spending. Right? So employment and income depend upon nothing but present expenditures, consumption plus investment. Now you notice in his framework, and this is the whole purpose of putting the case this way, saving for Keynes is just a residual. Savings is passively what's left over once a person, once aggregate income is set by spending and consumption. Saving, in other words, depends only upon what determines consumption and investment. So this is a key element for Keynes, right? Because why? Because saving is future oriented, and he wants to eliminate all future orientation. He doesn't want us to think that there's anything important in our, in the economic world from focusing on future things. He wants to eliminate this, and so this is what he's doing by erecting this sort of theoretical apparatus. Now, furthermore, again, you've seen these demonstrations, this kind of simple formulation of Keynes's views. Consumption, we know, is just a function of income, where it's a linear function of income, where changes in consumption depend solely upon changes in income. So we have something, what he called the marginal propensity to consume. Right? So this is what we decide upon. We decide upon our marginal propensity to consume. And we say, in other words, I wish to spend 90% of all additional income that I obtain. Again, notice what he's doing. He's reorienting our attention toward present things. The way in which in the Mengerian tradition we analyze this, of course, is to say, and we'll talk more about this in due course, but is to say that what decides the split between consumption and saving in the Mengerian view is time preference, right? So where's time preference here? Time preference drops out. Why does it drop out? Because time preference is future oriented. And Keynes wants to focus on the present. And so he says, let's instead of calling this time preference and talking about the ratio of saving, let's just talk about consumption and the ratio of consumption. Why? Because consumption is present. Marginal propensity to consume. And saving just becomes a residual. And then investment, we'll talk about how it's determined in a minute, right? That requires another set of theories that Keynes gives us. Okay, so consumption is determined by the MPC, and the MPC, remember, Keynes said, is a fundamental psychological law, sort of laughably claims that this is a fundamental psychological law, that when income goes up, consumption goes up by a smaller proportion. Okay, well, maybe this is true, but it hardly seems to rise to the status of a fundamental psychological law that this is true. If you look at the data, it, of course, it isn't true all the time. Sometimes consumption goes up more than the increases in income, and sometimes less, and it always varies in amount, and there doesn't seem to be any fixity or functional relationships we can establish, and so on. Okay, well, what else happens here? Well, the other thing that happens in this particular system is, since C is a function of income, the only way to get Y to go up is for investment to increase, right? Because C is a function of Y. And so you can't independently raise C to make Y go up. You can only increase investment. Now, the question then becomes, what happens when normally when we think about increasing investment, again in the Mengerian causal realist tradition, or even in just, say, in the classical tradition of economics, the story is always like this. If we want to invest more, we have to save. Saving and investing are companion aspects of constructing capital. So saving and investment go together, right? But in Keynes, he precisely wants to separate these two. He wants to say, we can have investment without saving. We can have the present spending without the future orientation. So how is this even feasibly or feasible within how can we make sense of this? Keynes says, well, this is the multiplier process. If investors will just step up and invest more, forget about saving, let's just say they invest more, then that will increase Y, right? Y will automatically go up by the increase in I, since Y is just C plus I. And then when Y goes up, C will go up, because it's a function of Y. And then when C goes up, that'll make Y go up again. And then when Y goes up, C will go up again, right? And this process is always round by round smaller, because the MPC is less than 1. But we get this multiplying effect. Now, what happens from the multiplying effect is that eventually, because of this multiplying effect, Y will rise to the point where S will increase to match the original increase in I. See, the funding for the investment comes after the investment is made. That's what Keynes is proposing here. We just invest more, then income will eventually go up. And because S is a fixed proportion of income, the MPS and the MPC are fixed here, we will eventually save enough to fund this investment. All we need to do is leap out. Right? Forget about economic calculation. All we need to do is, with our present, we need to be present-oriented, and on faith, we need to just start investing more. Now again, obviously you need money to do that, right? I mean, you have sort of a scarcity problem here. But Keynes said, well, this could be funded by the central bank. There's no problem, right? You just fund it with the central bank, fund it with credit expansion. We don't need saving. We just need people to invest. And when they invest, income will rise, and when income goes up, there'll be more saving, and that additional saving will then justify the investment. Ex post. You see, he's disconnecting all of the normal, economic calculation sense that we make out of this process. This is what he has in mind. This is what he's striving to do. Now, it also follows from this the paradox of saving. Right? What happens if people, to the contrary, hold to the old bourgeois idea that what we need to do if we want to accumulate capital is save more? Let's save more first and see what happens in Keynes's model. Well, if we save more, the only way we can do this, since saving is just a residual Y minus C, the only way we can do this is by lowering the MPC, right? Or raising the MPS. But if we lower the MPC, then what happens to consumption? Goes down. What happens to income? Goes down. We get the multiplier effect going back and forth, round by round, and income sinks. And when income goes down, what happens to saving? It goes down. This is a paradox of saving. We may be saving a greater portion of our income, but our aggregate income is reduced. So this is self-defeating. We should not look to the future. Saving is future-oriented, right? If we look to the future, we'll impoverish ourselves. That's what Keynes has come up with here. I mean, from his viewpoint, this is a brilliant innovation, is it not? This is pretty clever. This is the sort of thing you would expect somebody like Paul Krugman to come up with. It's very clever. Right? And that's really what's the only thing that's behind it. It is just the desire to show, to make these kinds of disconnections, to show that we need to be present-oriented, if we want both prosperity and then this higher standard of life that Marshall talks about. Okay, now let's go to talking about investment. How is investment determined? This is where we get to the business cycle part, right? Remember, consumers are sort of robotic and mechanistic in their spending, and it's just a function of income, and it's relatively stable and so on. So certainly no business cycle is going to come from this, right? Business cycles are swings in aggregate demand according to Keynesian model. The swings would have to come from investment. So why does that happen? Right? This instability, where does this come from? Again, we would think that from the causal realist position that, economic calculation would not tend to produce a business cycle. If we just had a regular free market economy, no fractional reserve banking, central banks, or any state intervention, that economic calculation would tend to dampen all unsustainable booms and busts, right? Because investors would perceive immediately that as it gets going, that this is excessive. And in any case, investors would have to be drawing resources out of other places in the economy to build up a boom, in one place in the economy. So it's hard to see how we would get an overall boom and bust in the economy. Okay, well anyway, what Keynes says here, the basic theory that he has is what he calls the marginal efficiency of capital. So this is what he's using to explain the level of investment. And the marginal efficiency of capital, according to Keynes, is the rate of return. Is the rate of return, or the incremental rate of return, the marginal rate of return, on an amount of monetary investment. It's just the rate of return, basically. And so he says this. He says, look, it's the way in which people's perception of the future affects their present spending is not through the interest rate. It's not through saving and investing, right? It's not through saving itself and then investing. It's through rates of return. Rates of return on investment. It's through the MEC. So notice he's redirecting again our ideas about how people engage in speculation, how the investors speculate about the future, away from future orientation. I want to save in order to aim at satisfying some end in the future. I want to save now and build an auto plant and satisfy those demands for cars in the future, right? To what are my present calculations of rates of return that I can get immediately from making this investment? What do I get when I spend right now on this particular line of investment? So he's again trying to redirect away from the future and toward the present. Okay, well, what he says then is that all investors do is compare the rates of return to the interest rate. And then they decide on every investment that exceeds the MEC. So we have an MEC, slopes downward to the right. In fact, it even has a negative section in Keynes. So it looks like this. And so we have some investments with very high rates of return, other with intermediate rates of return, right? We can calculate all this, he alleges. And then we have an interest rate. So maybe this is 10% and this is 12%. And let's say the interest rate is 8%. And so the amount of investment would be the sum of all the investments that have a marginal efficiency of capital above the interest rate. All those could be funded profitably, right? That's how he puts it. And then none of these would be undertaken if you can only get 6% return on an investment. You won't borrow at 8% or give up the opportunity cost of investing at 8% in the credit markets in order to make these investments down here. So these investments never get done. Now, this according to Keynes is a bad thing, that these investments don't get done. This is a limitation on present spending, which would accumulate capital more readily and push us into this utopian stage. You see, this is the defect of the capitalist calculation process. In order to remove the scarcity of capital, you would have to have investment at this point, where the MEC was 0, according to Keynes. There isn't any reason, according to Keynes, that you shouldn't invest in every investment project that has a positive MEC, positive rate of return. The interest rate, as we'll see, is just an arbitrary price that's set by precaution and other sort of emotional features of human beings. And in any case, it's determined only by monetary factors. We'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, well, what's the corrective to this? What's the basic response to this? Remember, the basic response to this in the causal realist view, and actually we'll talk more about this in the upcoming lecture at 11:30 on time and uncertainty, if you haven't already heard this, is that the actual underlying rate of return of all investments is the interest rate. Right? You cannot calculate these MECs in terms of rates of return. No, the going rate of return is always just the rate of interest. Let's say, for example, that and this is true on any investment, the rate of return is the same. It's the rate of interest. Well, why is this so? Well, let's suppose that you did have an investment that would, be highly profitable. Well, what happens? Investors rush in to exploit that, right? And as they rush in to buy the capital goods that can produce this investment project, they rush in to, let's say, buy equipment to produce houses during the boom. What happens to the prices of capital?
Is this partially caused by capital theory? So
yes,
see that there is
exactly true. He has no capital theory behind this. If you insert capital theory in here, you can see that what happens to this alleged higher rate of return is that it's brought down to the rate of interest because the entrepreneurial bidding for the capital goods to invest in this rate of return will be bid up. And once those capital goods prices are once the asset prices are bid up, then the rate of return is normalized to the rate of interest. And this would continue anytime there's any difference between this calculation, if you're doing a calculation like this of rate of interest, relative to the MEC. Now, we're going to set aside for this analysis, if you're sort of thinking maybe there's something missing in this. Yeah, there is something missing in what I've presented as a counter to this, and that's profit. But this is a separate thing, right? How in fact would an entrepreneur be able to, in advance, build into a rate of return his profitability? So that's problematic. We're not dealing with that particular question at this point. But here we're just dealing with, what could be known from existing prices, and not the uncertainty and the return to foresight of the entrepreneur. Just what exists, what differences exist between selling prices and buying prices in the market as it exists now. And if there's a huge difference, then entrepreneurs will rush in to buy the factors of production to sell into this market. And when they do, they'll shrink this gap, right? And when they shrink this gap, how far will it go down? It'll go down to the rate of interest. And all those will be normalized. So there really isn't any such a thing as the MEC. Or we could say it differently. Investment decisions are made by entrepreneurs when they compare asset values to liability values. They're not made by comparing MECs, rates of return, to interest rates. Okay, so what else did Keynes say here? This isn't his only claim about capital markets. Well, he said in capitalism, these MECs have to be estimated by the entrepreneur. Seems reasonable. We have uncertainty, and the entrepreneur is engaged in these estimations. And he says this will be poorly done. And it's poorly done in part because economic calculation, entrepreneurs tend to place irrational emphasis on remote future gains. They tend to take account, in other words, of remote future gains. Let's say they're going to invest in an automobile plant. They would take account of what revenues will be earned 20 years from now. And he says, well, that's just foolish. No, you shouldn't take account of these future things. Why? Because I believe in present orientation. I don't think these future things are worth much, right? They should be completely discounted and written off, and we should focus just on present-oriented things. And then he says the knowledge that entrepreneurs have of these future returns or revenues are extremely uncertain. Remember, Keynes wrote a book on the theory of probability. It's sort of unusual for an economist, right, to write a book on probability theory. Why did he do this? Because he wanted to show that future estimations by entrepreneurs are unscientific. You can't do them, right, except on the basis of a certain scientific view of probability, which entrepreneurs don't take. And therefore, these MEC estimates are wildly wrong. We should give over these decisions to experts, to government officials, to Keynesians, who are experts on probability theory, and then they would be better at doing this. This is what he said. It's hard to say what he actually thought about all this, but this was his proposal, right? Okay, then he also had a theory about the stock market, and this again is where we eventually get to his business cycle theory. So he said, in capitalism, there's an irrational striving for liquidity. And we'll talk more about this in the next point on liquidity preference. But for the stock market, what this means is that the stock market will emerge. In other words, people who make investments will want to be able to liquidate their investments anytime they want. And so they'll be trading in stock shares, as opposed to, say, just investing with a capitalist in the bond market and then having no secondary bond market. We're just kind of locked into this investment. No, people want liquidity, right? And this desire for liquidity he thought was irrational. We'll talk again more about why he thought it was irrational in a minute. And therefore we get a stock market. Now, why is this bad? Again, from the causal realist view, it seems like a stock market is a good thing. Remember, Mises said that the stock market is sort of the pinnacle of the capitalist system in terms of capital allocation. So why would this be a bad thing? And Keynes says it's a bad thing because now investors have the option between investing in a new production process or investing in stock. Well, when they invest in stock, we don't get any additional capital accumulation, he said. They're just buying shares of, ownership shares in the assets of existing firms. It's only when they invest in new production venture capital, we might say, that we get this capital accumulation process set in motion. So this irrational striving for liquidity just channels investable funds into sterile forms of spending. Now again, here Keynes is just denying this whole causal realist argument about how the capital markets allocate capital, how the stock markets allocate capital, right? So my favorite example of this is Amazon. So Jeff Bezos starts Amazon in the mid-90s. It's a little operation, right? And he goes public. And when he goes public, people start buying shares of his stock, and this pushes the price of his stock up. And this capitalizes Bezos, right? This actually adds value to his balance sheet. This accumulates equity into his balance sheet for two different reasons. One is that he is the primary stockholder in Amazon. So since he owns the asset, when other people bid up the price of the asset that he owns, he gets part of the value. Just like if I own a house and everybody around me is bidding up the price of houses, I get part of the value of that, right? The value of my house goes up. That's realizable capital value. I can go take out a home equity loan against that additional equity in my house. Bezos can now borrow against that additional asset value. He can take on liabilities. So you can go to the capital markets and borrow. Capital is being allocated by the stock market to those firms where investors are anticipating greater future benefits and away from others. So there is an allocation process here that Keynes is denying. Okay, so now on the business cycle, Keynes says, look, what happens then is that stock prices are set just by sort of the average expectations of the middle of the road dummy investors. Anybody can invest in stock, right? And so we don't get professionals doing this. We just get the average person. And the average person doesn't have any idea of what the value of stocks happens to be. Only the experts do. And so they just rely upon the kind of state of confidence, right? To sort of how they feel about the markets. Are they confident in rising prices, or are they pessimistic, and so on? So you can see where this is going, right? The period of wave of optimism comes over the investors. Their animal spirits are energized, and they overinvest, and they drive up the stock prices, and they invest in real things too, and they drive up the prices there. And then suddenly they become pessimistic. They pull in their horns for whatever reason, and then we get the collapse, right? So the whole business cycle is driven by this kind of irrational process that he's describing for us of the market in terms of investable funds. Now, again, how do you get rid of this? Well, you get rid of this by scientifically managing investment. You get rid of this by socializing investment, by putting investment decisions into the hands of government officials. We seem to be going through perhaps a grand experiment in this. We'll see whether or not the investments that government officials have been making en masse prove, in fact, to be better or worse than what entrepreneurs and investors, have done in the past, or perhaps would have done with these things. He also says, and this is key to another theory he has. We may not actually get to this. I'm running short of time, but I want to mention this because it shows you how far Keynes will go in this kind of development of unorthodox theories to defend his position. He says financial markets there's also kind of a defect in financial markets in general. It's let's say the general bond markets, setting aside the speculative elements of the stock market. He says financial markets create an artificial element of risk because they bifurcate the saver-lender from the borrower-investor. These are now two different parties. And because they're two different parties, you get this artificial risk that's created of the risk of default of the borrower-investor that would not exist, he claims, if the saver-lender was in fact the same person as the borrower-investor. If people were all self-financing, in other words, he says, there would not be risk of default that exists on the market. Okay, well that seems really over the top. That seems just almost obviously false on the face of it, right? But he needs to have this theory. He needs to be able to say that even if central bank policy could drive the regular interest rate, the kind of supply and demand interest rate down to zero, it wouldn't make the actual paid interest rate zero, because you would still have to pay people to borrow money because of this risk of default in capitalism. And so even if under the market interest rates could be driven completely to zero in the sense that there was enough saving and investing so that we reached this point, the actual interest rate in the market would not be zero, and we still wouldn't get capital saturation, so to speak. We wouldn't get enough investment. Okay, now let me talk about his theory of liquidity preference. This is his theory of the interest rate, right? The other part of the determination of investment. So investment is determined by the MEC relative to the rate of interest. So what about the interest rate? Okay, so Keynes, remember, famously said here that the interest rate is determined by liquidity preference, or what we would call money demand, the demand for money, and the stock of money. So interest for Keynes is a strictly monetary phenomena. It's not grounded in time preference or even let's say saving and investing impulses, or that the classical economists might say. But it's purely a monetary phenomenon. Now, it works in the following way, according to Keynes. We have this, we mentioned before, this decision from the individual person who earns income. He then splits it between consumption and saving, right? That through the MPC, he decides to split this way. And then he decides on his saving, then he decides to split his saving between money holdings and bonds. Okay, so saving is saving is everything in Keynes that isn't spent on consumption. So he can save in two forms, holding money and bonds. Now remember, the Rothbard gives us the alternative view of this, where he says his equation looks like this, right? He says a person has income and he splits it between consumption, saving and investing, which go together, and money holdings. Right? There are three elements of choice. And as he puts it, the split here is determined by time preference, and money holding is determined by the subjective value of money, subjective value of holding money. Right? Well, Keynes has an entirely different schematic here, right? He says, first we have income, we split between consumption and saving. Once we determine on the amount of saving, or the amount of consumption, and then the saving is left over, then we decide between money holding and interest earning forms of saving. Now, one of the reasons he does this is he wants to be able to say that saving obviously is not done to earn interest. Because when you hold money, you don't earn interest, right? So there must be a different motive for saving, since saving is M plus B. You can't rely just upon an interest argument to generate saving. So he says, what is this motive? Remember, here's where he comes up with the famous motives for holding money, transactions, right? We want to hold some money to have our transactions, a precautionary motive or speculative motive. And a speculative motive. Now, it's a speculative motive that he focuses on. That's the key for Keynes. Whereas these other two, transactions and precautionary, depend upon income and hence are sort of stable. The speculative element is not. The speculative element is, speculative, subject to wide swings. Now, what would happen in his model if there are wide swings in the speculative demand for money? Remember, his theory is that, or to have it graphically, it would look like this. And so we have money and the interest rates, and we have the money stock, and we have money demand. Right? And part of the money demand is speculative. And so that means it's going to swing widely, right? It's going to gyrate all over the place. And as it does this, the interest rate's going to go bouncing up and down. Now, when the interest rate is bouncing up and down, then won't this affect the investor's decisions to invest? Won't this make it difficult for the investor to say, oh, now I see that the MEC is above this interest rate, I'll go ahead and invest. No, he'll shrink back and say, wait a minute, it's right down here today, but I think maybe it's going to bounce up like this, and I shouldn't invest, I'll hold back. Right? So you can see where what he's aiming at in making this suggestion. Okay, and then the other thing he says about the liquidity preference, or about this schematic about money demand and liquidity preference, is that, and I know this sounds somewhat like a paradox, at least it does to me. He says this. He says, while speculative demand can make the interest rate just pop all over the place, there's also something like a sort of conventional interest rate. Just like investors in the stock market, invest on the basis of the consensus of what's going on in the market. It's a similar thing here. There's kind of consensus of what the interest rate should be. It should be 5% or 6% or something of the sort. And so people will, with the other parts of their liquidity preference, will tend to be very conventional. And therefore, while the interest rate may be bouncing around, it tends to bounce around a conventional level. Let's say 6%. Right? That tends to be relatively fixed. Then we bounce around it. Well, the problem is, right, if people conventionally think that the interest rate is going to be 6%, they won't invest in any projects below a 6% MEC. And you get a restriction on investment, right? You have to force this down somehow. And of course, you can force this down through expansionary monetary policy. Right? You can push the money supply out to the right, and the interest rate would clear then at a lower level. That's good. He was definitely in favor of monetary inflation and pushing interest rates down to the lowest possible level. But remember, here's where the theory of the liquidity trap comes in. He says, look, eventually you're going to push the interest rate down to the point where, because people think conventionally about these things, everyone thinks the interest rate will rise. Everyone thinks in the future that the interest rate's going to go up. Well, then what happens? Well, then nobody will be buying bonds today, right? Any additional money that you supply into the market will just be absorbed and held. Liquidity preference becomes infinite. And so you get no effect on spending, whatever. You get no effect on aggregate demand from inflationary monetary policy and a liquidity trap. And again, 10 years ago, we thought all this talk about liquidity traps and liquidity preference and MECs and everything was just ancient history. It was just like a history of thought or something. But now we have Krugman talking about liquidity traps in Japan in the 1990s. And, the whole thing is back, unfortunately, in spades. Okay, well, let me briefly mention, just because I want to get this in, and you can read Joe Salerno's article to pick up the loose ends that I'm leaving here on this. But I do want to mention Joe has a fourth theoretical pillar, if you will, of Keynes's general theory. And this is what he calls the scarcity theory of capital. So Keynes also had this, and it's a somewhat ignored part of the general theory, this theory of the scarcity, or this idea of the scarcity theory of capital. And here what he said was, the reason why we get positive MECs, the reason why we get positive rates of return is because there's a positive interest rate. Remember again, if we had a zero interest rate, then all investment would be undertaken until the MEC was zero. So all those past investments, at the margin, all investable projects would earn a zero rate of return. So the only reason we have a positive rate of return is because we have a positive interest rate. And that's what creates the scarcity of capital. What we need to do is get rid of that interest rate. Because if we can get rid of the interest rate, we can force We can engage in all the investable projects where the MEC is positive and eliminate the scarcity of capital. This is his idea, right? The theory of the scarcity of capital. Now, the basic... Yes, I'm sorry.
What's the name of the...
It's still Keynes. It's still John Maynard Keynes.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, his idea was this. Let's suppose that we have in capitalism... Well, in capitalism what happens is this. Let's suppose that it's possible to be in a scenario of, let's say, monetary inflation or however greater saving or whatever it is that pushes the interest rate down. He says, it might be possible that greater capital accumulation would actually reduce the MEC faster than the interest rate is falling, and therefore choke off, so to speak, this dynamic process of continuing investment. And finally, he says on the again, I'm leaving loose ends here, but finally on the idea of the scarcity theory of capital, he says, let's suppose that capitalism reached nirvana. We get this point where the scarcity of capital is eliminated, the MEC is zero. But let's suppose at this point the MPS is also positive. That is, the MPC is still less than 1. Remember, he said that's a fundamental psychological law, that it's less than 1. So presumably we can't get rid of this, right? Well, then what would happen? Let's suppose we, just accidentally somehow reach this equilibrium where the MEC is zero, and so we have, full employment, we have, the maximum amount of income generated and so on, but the MPC is less than 1. Well, then, remember this equation would be without investment, right? The MEC is zero, there's no more investment, and we just have y is equal to c. But if the MPC is less than 1, then c would be less than y, right? At that equilibrium level. And so what would happen? Well, the economy would begin to shrink. Because the multiplier would be set in motion, right? If y momentarily is greater than c, then in the next round y will have to fall. Right? Because y is equal to c. Because we don't have investment. Investment is zero in this world. And so the economy would simply sink back into a stagnant, under optimal equilibrium. Even if it were capable of achieving the nirvana point, to begin with. Okay, well at this point I'll stop. So thank you.